Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Wednesday class on the book of Ecclesiastes. Today we're looking at chapter 9 of Solomon's writings, in which he tries to help us get a focus on the brevity of life. He's talked about all of the chaotic things that can happen. We see goodness, we see foolishness, we see evil, we see good. And so how do we react and how do we respond, or how do we live our lives in light of all of these things that we're going to be facing? And so as we continue through our study, we're using Mike Willis's book on the book of Ecclesiastes, his workbook study, as a guide for what we're going to look at here in Ecclesiastes chapter 9. In question 1, he says, what can one know about God's disposition toward man from what he sees in life? Let's look at verse 1. He said, for all this I considered in mine heart, even to declare all this, that the righteous and the wise and their works are in the hand of God. No man knoweth either love or hatred by all that is before him. We just don't know what's going to happen in God's providential care of man. We do not know how things are going to unfold. And it's folly for us to use human measures to try to understand whether or not God is pleased with us or God is blessing us. And that, in other words, we can sometimes impose the idea that if I'm rich, if I'm blessed, if I have a lot, then obviously God is pleased with me, and that is a sign that I am righteous. That was the earmarking of the Sadducees' doctrine in the New Testament. Was that, see, I have wealth, so obviously I am blessed of God, and he is very, very pleased with me. But that's not what Solomon's teaching us here. The English Standard Version on this says, their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. We just do not know how things are going to work together. As you've already noticed in previous studies, God's ways are higher than our ways. The exaltation of man or the abasement of man all comes in God's good time, based upon unfolding circumstances. And oftentimes there are many factors involved of which we simply are not in a position to know and to understand. So Solomon is saying we can't set down some arbitrary standard and say, oh, this means either good or evil or God or blessing. We're not always going to be able to be as comfortable with those conclusions as we might first think. In question 2, he says, what did Solomon observe about what happens to the wicked and the righteous in life, according to verse 2? He said, all these things come alike to all. There is one event to the righteous and to the wicked, to the good and to the clean, and to the unclean, to him that sacrificeth, and to him that sacrificeth not. As is the good, so is the sinner, and he that sweareth, as he that feareth an oath. He said there is an event that's going to befall everybody, whether we're at the good end of the spectrum or the evil and unclean end of the spectrum. He's pointing out here that the blessings and cursings of nature are going to be felt by all men without discrimination. God sends, as Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 45, God sends rain upon the just and on the unjust. So we cannot use some kind of arbitrary measure to determine whether God is pleased with us or not. It's a matter of our looking to God's word and following what's there. And then we can determine righteousness. But as far as the events of what happens to us in life, those things are going to be way beyond our comprehension. I think of the story that Jesus told in the Gospel of Luke about the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus was a beggar. His life here was miserable. And in the eyes of many people and in the evaluation of many people, his low lot in life probably was ascribed to sinful, careless living. But as we continue on through the story that Jesus told, Lazarus was a righteous man and wound up being blessed of God in a place of rest. And there you have the rich man that many would have thought, oh, he is so blessed because he must be such a good man. and he winds up in torment. So we cannot use human measures to determine right and wrong, or the righteousness of God or the unrighteousness of a person. And Solomon is trying to help us see that point. In question 3, he said, what event happens alike to all men? Notice here in verse 2, he said, all these things come alike to all. There is one event to the righteous and to the wicked. Well, the one event that is a certainty for all men, if the Lord tarries to come in his return, is that event of death. And that's going to stop our interactions here in this life. In question 4, why is this an evil under the sun? Well, the point he's making here, according to verse 3, is that the evil and the good are all going to experience this same event. Let's see how he says it. This is an evil among all things that are done under the sun, that there is one event unto all. Yea, also the heart of the sons of men is full of evil, and madness is in their heart while they live, and after that they go to the dead. The point is that we make our choices, be they righteous or be they unrighteous, but this one event is going to end our journey here on this earth. That's going to be the event of death. And the good die just as do the evil. It is an eventuality for all of us, which is a very sobering thought. Now in question 5, the author asks, how do you harmonize Ecclesiastes 4:2, Ecclesiastes 7:1, and Ecclesiastes 9:4? Well, let's go back and look at these passages and see what they're saying. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and going down to verse 2, it says, wherefore I praise the dead which are already dead more than the living which are yet alive. There's an avenue here that Solomon is exploring, that in some ways oppression ends. In some ways hardship ends. In some ways the difficulties of our journey here will expire at some given point. And so Solomon is saying, at least at that stage, things begin to even out as we begin to look on toward eternity. Going over to the 7th chapter and going down to verse 1. He's made the point from chapter 4 and verse 2 that the oppression that people go through, the difficulties and the mistreatments and all of those things are going to be history once we have finished our days here. Over in the 7th chapter and verse 1, he says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. He goes on to talk in the next verse about how it's better to go to the house of mourning, because death makes all men stop and reflect upon the brevity of life. That even our hard life here will one day be over, and there's a better life that awaits the righteous. One day things are going to change. Yes, even to the righteous man who has abundance and maybe has been greatly blessed of God, one day he's going to leave all those blessings, all those riches behind him. So all of this begins to line up with Solomon's view of what he's talking about. In chapter 4 then, or chapter 9, and going down to verse 4, he says, for to him that is joined to all the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. Yes, death is going to be a change. It's going to be a transition to another realm of existence. But while we have life here, we have hope. We can be working toward that eternal reward. We can have the trust that God will look out for us and see to it that all things will work together for good, even though the journey here may be somewhat difficult. So Solomon is not exalting death and having a morbid sense of wishing for one's life to end. He's just saying that with that final reality, it gives all men pause to think. It makes them reflect. It gives them hope in that they realize that even when these hard days beset us here in this life, that one day there will be a rest from all of these labors and all of this will have passed away. So while we are here, enjoy the journey, look forward to the better days that are ahead, both in this life and in the eternity to come. So Solomon's message is amazingly consistent, even though he approaches it from a variety of different standpoints. In question 6, he says, what do verses 5 and 6 say about the dead? He says, for the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything, neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love and their hatred and their envy is now perished. Neither have they any more a portion forever in anything that is done under the sun. The point that Solomon is making here is there comes a time in which all of this is going to be past history. Once we die, all contact or interaction with life here under the sun is now over. Even the rich man in the story of the rich man and Lazarus realized that he could not go back and give warning to his brethren. It was going to take some divine intervention even for Lazarus to be able to go back and warn them to turn from their wicked way. When we take our last breath here, our interactions and our influences here in many ways are over, and we begin to fade into that of a memory. We can go to a cemetery and see individuals that we maybe have known, and those memories are fresh in our mind. We can picture them and remember our conversations with them. But then maybe we move back 2 or 3 generations, and those memories aren't so clear, and those interactions are not so vivid. And maybe we only know of some of these people by the family stories that have been handed down. Their days are over, and they are but a brief memory in the minds of those alive who can still recall having had some interaction with them. So death is the phasing out of our impact and our existence here and our moving on to something else. In question 7, he says, since verse 6 is cited as proof that man does not have an immortal soul, cite several texts showing that man does have a soul which survives the body after he has died, or it survives the death of the body. There are some religious organizations who take the approach of the Sadducees, that we live our lives here and then we die. We don't have a soul. There's not an immortal part of man. Whatever blessings we get from God are the things that we receive while we're alive in this life. There's nothing beyond this life. And there are many people who live their lives blocking out God, not thinking about God, and secretly inside hoping there isn't a life after this one because they've made no preparation for it. But there are several verses that we can go to in which we can look at the fact that the New Testament in particular talks to us about the soul of man, that there is a part of us that lives on after we have drawn our last breath here. Over in Matthew chapter 22 and going down to verse 32, Jesus is talking here and he says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Well, our physical bodies have been laid to rest, but there is a part of us that's still alive. That immortal soul has gone to the God that gave it. And Solomon makes that point over in the 12th chapter of Ecclesiastes, that the body goes back to the dust, but the soul goes back to the God that gave it. In the book of Ecclesiastes and going down to chapter 12. Over in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 16, Paul talks also some more about this. He says, for which cause we faint not, but though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle, if our bodies were destroyed or dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house which is from heaven. For so be that being clothed we shall not be found naked. For we that are in this tabernacle do groan, being burdened, not that we should be unclothed, but clothed upon, and mortality might be swallowed up of life. Now he that hath wrought us for this selfsame thing is God, who also hath given unto us the earnest of the Spirit. Therefore we are always with confidence, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. For we walk by faith and not by sight. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Wherefore we labor, that whether present or absent, we may be accepted of him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that every one may receive the things done in his body, according to that he hath done, whether it be good or evil. So there will be a judgment day. We will be clothed with a new body, and that body will take us then into eternity. In Philippians chapter 1, beginning in verse 21, Paul says, For to me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. For if I live in the flesh, then is the fruit of my labor. Yet what shall I choose? I want not. For I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart, to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. And then, of course, we have what Jesus told the thief in Luke chapter 23 and verse 43, as he was about to die on the cross. He told that thief that it was not over. He said, This day thou shalt be with me in paradise. And then, as we've already mentioned, from Luke 16, verses 19 through 31, we have the story given by Jesus of the eventuality or the eternity of the rich man and Lazarus. So there is a host of verses to help us understand that there is a life beyond this one. And those individuals who want to take some of Solomon's comments about the idea of death and the relationships that end and the fact that we will go on to something else, and they want to make it sound as though Solomon is saying, see, you just live and die and it's all over, those verses are being taken out of a context. In question 8, he said, what light, in light of death's certainty, how then shall we live? Well, the point that he makes here in verse 7 of Ecclesiastes chapter 9 is to help us understand that God does not intend for us to go through a life here having nothing but misery and sorrow and being depressed and downtrodden. Looking at verse 7, he says, Go thy way, eat thy bread with joy, and drink thy wine with a merry heart, for God now accepteth thy works. In other words, live in the moment. Live here in the time that you have. Enjoy the pleasures of this life, all of the blessings that God has given to us. Remember earlier on, Solomon taught us that these good moments and these good times are given as gifts from God. So live our lives in joy and live them within the bounds of godliness. Over in Titus chapter 2 and verse 12, we are taught that we are to deny ungodliness and worldly lust. Those are things that are off limits. Those things are sin. Those are not things we want to do because we'll be held accountable for all that sin. So denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. And Paul tells us, especially in writing to the Philippians, that that's going to be a source of tremendous joy, both in this life and in the life to come. In question 9, how can you harmonize drink wine with a merry heart, as he mentions here in verse 7, with other passages out of the scriptures, such as Proverbs 23, 29 through 35, Proverbs 20 and verse 1, and 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3. And he simply asks the question, is drinking acceptable so long as one does not get drunk? There are some folks who strive mightily to find any glimmer of a passage that says, see, this justifies my drinking a little bit and allowing that to loosen me up and allowing me to have a good time. Well, let's look at the verses that are mentioned. In Proverbs 23, beginning in verse 29, he said, Who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath babbling? Who hath wounds without cause? Or who hath redness of eyes? they that tarry long at the wine, they that go and seek mixed wine. Look not thereupon the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. At the last it biteth like a serpent, and stingeth like an adder. Thine eyes shall behold strange women, and thine heart shall utter perverse things. Yea, thou shalt be as he that lieth down in the midst of the sea, or as he that lieth upon the top of a mast. They have stricken me, shalt thou say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I awake? And I will seek it yet again. He makes the point of this drunkenness becoming habitual. Our getting wounds of all different sorts. We don't remember what we did. We make bad judgments. That there is all kinds of problems associated with our drinking of alcohol. Over in the 20th chapter of Proverbs, this same writer is saying wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Now, when we move over to the New Testament, Peter gave us some very stringent instruction about this concept of drinking, and he gives it to us in degrees. He helps us to understand that there is a way of living that Christians have left behind. He calls it living like the way of the Gentiles. And these were things that people used to do when they were walking separated from God. He says, for in time past our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, and notice the terms that he uses here that involve wine. Excess of wine, which is talking about pretty much the sot drunkard, the individual who is drunken more than he is sober. There are some folks like that. And Peter here is saying that's what it's like for some Gentiles who were too long at the wine. But then he talks about revelings. And that word associates itself with the drinking bouts or the parties where someone only gets plastered once in a while. Maybe it's not a daily occurrence, but he still is involved in reveling in this drinking in which his judgment is impaired and which he does inappropriate things. So the excessive wine would be wrong. The revelings is wrong. And then he uses the term banquetings, which is defined as your social drinking. That drinking in moderation. But yet he puts it right here in these paths that are followed by ungodly men who do not fear God. He puts it right in there with lasciviousness and lusts. And he goes on to the very last phrase and says abominable idolatries. So any association with alcohol in the scriptures is not looked at as a good thing, save it would be for some kind of medicinal purpose. So Solomon here is not saying that you need to get drunk every now and then to be merry and to have a good time as the world might like to define it. You know, the idea of wine is sometimes used in the scriptures to simply talk about unfermented grape juice. It is that which is fresh from the winepress. In Isaiah 16 and going down to about verse 10, the prophet says, and gladness is taken away, and joy out of the plentiful field. And in the vineyards there shall be no singing, neither shall there be shouting. The treaders shall tread out no wine in their presses. I have made their vintage shouting to cease. In other words, the point that he's making is that there is such a thing as the fresh grape juice. Here he says it's not, and because of the turmoil that was about to come, that was going to cease. But the word wine appears to help us understand it does not have the type of connotation that we frequently associate with it as we look to the common denominators of definition that people would like to use in our day and time. So in verse 8 here of Ecclesiastes, chapter 9, what is it that Solomon is actually counseling for us to do? What is to be the way in which we make our choices? What type of lifestyle are we supposed to have? Here in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and going to verse 9, he says, live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of the life of thy vanity, which he hath given thee under the sun, all the days of thy vanity. For that is thy portion in this life, and of the labor which thou takest under the sun. So if we back up just a little bit to verse 8, he's saying, let thy garments be always white, and let thy head lack no ointment. So let's put all these things together. In verse 8, he is counseling for us to be happy, for us to be able to be in purity, to live as dressed in white, and that we're dressed up like we're going someplace special. Our hair is anointed, so to speak, and so we are trying to live happily and cheerfully in this life, looking at those good moments of joy. And then in verse 9, as we look at question 11, he says, what does verse 9 counsel? Well, there he's talking about enjoying the wife that you've chosen, your family ties. Enjoy the family relationship, because as he has taught us in other passages as well, it is a gift from God for man's happiness. Remember, at creation, God saw that it was not good that man should be alone. In question 12, what does "this is thy portion in life" mean? Well, it's what Solomon is teaching is that is what God has intended for us to have. This is the prescribed path that he wants us to follow, to have these moments of joy and goodness in this life. In question 13, what view of work is presented if we look at verse 10? Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. For there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest. The point that he's making is that work is a blessed occupation of our time while we are here in this life. We find from the very beginning, even Adam and Eve were to dress the garden, and later that work became more difficult after man's disobedience. But we don't just sit and stare. There are things to do to occupy our time. There are pursuits that we need to develop. And Solomon says, so do that while you have the chance. Because there's coming a day when your hands are folded in eternal rest and your body is no longer functional, you have died, that those options will not be open to you anymore to find the satisfaction that would come from such labor. In question 14, what do verses 11 and 12 say about the influences, the outcome of man's activities? In verses 11 and 12, he says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, and that the battle is not to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. For man also knoweth not his time, as the fishes that are taken in an evil net, and as the birds that are caught in the snare. So are the sons of men snared in an evil time, when it falleth suddenly upon them. So the point that he's making here is that life is unpredictable, and the unexpected is going to happen. Time and chance happens to them all. And he compares it to the idea of fish being caught in a net or birds being caught by a snare. He said those animals did not expect themselves to be caught. They didn't realize there was even a trap there. The point is that our time and chance, the circumstances may change abruptly when we have no foreshadowing of it coming. And so we need to be prepared. And so since each day could be our last, we're to enjoy those days and to live them to the best of our abilities in service unto God. In question 15, what incident did Solomon see in verses 13 through 15? He said, this wisdom have I also seen under the sun, and it seemed great unto me. There was a little city, and few men within it, and there came a great king against it, and besieged it, and built great bulwarks against it. Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no man remembered that same poor man. Then I said, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Here he gives the instance of a poor wise man, somebody of little repute or reputation, was able to deliver a city because there was an aggressor outside who looked to obviously be the winner because he had superior forces and whatnot. But this man knew a wise course of action that could spare the city. They followed his advice, and they were able to escape destruction. But then when it was all over, this man was not remembered or rewarded for the wise counsel that he gave. He said, just because we're wise, just because we share wise counsel, that doesn't mean that we're going to be exalted and automatically rise to the top of the pile. In question 16, what injustice was associated with this? Well, it's like he says there in that last verse, yet no man remembered the same poor man. He just did not receive much for helping everybody out. So in question 17, it says, what two things does verse 16 say about wisdom? He said, then I said, wisdom is better than strength. That would be one of the things about wisdom. It is better than strength. And then he goes on, nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. So secondly, the wisdom of a poor man may be despised, and he may be ignored. You may have wisdom, you may have the answer, but maybe no one's going to listen. So wisdom is going to be one of those virtues that can be of great benefit to you. It can make you stronger than even the well-armed man, if you know how to fight smart, so to speak, or how to avoid the conflict altogether. And there'd be somebody else with wisdom who may have all kinds of things that could help him out and help others as well. But his counsel is ignored because others don't see the value of it. In question 18, he says, what two things are compared in verse 17, and which is better? He said, the words of wise men are heard in quiet more than the cry of him that ruleth among fools. He says here that you have a comparison between the quiet words of wisdom from a wise man as opposed to the loud sayings of a fool. You've got the two to listen to. There are going to be some who will take note of the wisdom of the wise man, will listen and follow it. But others will be completely turned off by it, and they will go after the louder voice, and it may be the voice of the fool. And so the voice of that wisdom or the wise man is the better course. In question 19, he says, what two things in verse 18a are compared? He said, wisdom is better than weapons, and weapons of war. And so those are the comparisons that we're looking at. Wisdom is going to give you the best course despite the unlikely circumstances in which we may find ourselves. And that's going to be better to have that wisdom and maybe avoid the conflict altogether than to have mighty weapons of war that destroys everybody. But one sinner destroyeth much good is the rest of that verse. And that's what takes us to question 20. What does verse 18b say about the effect of one sinner in undermining wisdom? We might have the wisdom, we might be able to help in a lot of different ways, but one sinner may sweep all of that aside. His loud shouting may be taken as counsel to some who are just as foolish as he is, and this wisdom and wise advice is left go. I think about the counselors that Rehoboam had. He had wise men of experience who gave him good counsel, but then there were younger men who did not have such wisdom. They gave bad counsel, and unfortunately Rehoboam listened to them, and the kingdom of Israel was split in two. So there can be dire consequences when wisdom is ignored. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our study today from Ecclesiastes chapter 9. That we've had the chance to look at the value of wisdom, the reality of death, and how our best course is to live wisely here, enjoy the moments that we have before the day of our death comes, because it's going to come to all men, but to be ready for when that day comes for us. Hope you've enjoyed the study. Look forward to joining you again next week, Lord willing.